Tiny twin girls carrying a bucket and wearing cleaning outfits walked into a single Billionaire'S company. And what they asked for brought him to tears. The digital clock on the wall read 7:32 a.m. when Mark Davis walked through the revolving doors of Davis Tower. The 50-story glass and steel building reflected the first rays of the New York sun. "Good morning, Mr. Davis," said the security guard, using the same respectful tone everyone did. Mark only nodded. Words were resources he preferred to conserve, especially before his first cup of coffee. At 42, Mark had achieved what many would need 3 lifetimes to accomplish. Davis Enterprises dominated the tech market, with innovations that had transformed the way the world communicated. His face appeared in business magazines and on TV shows. What no one saw were the lonely nights in his penthouse apartment, the meals eaten alone, the absence of laughter or voices, except for the virtual assistant that controlled everything in his home. "Mr. Davis, the meeting with the Japanese investors has been moved up to 9, reported Helen, his personal assistant, as she walked alongside him across the lobby. Mark adjusted his navy blue tie. "Cancel it." "But sir, they traveled." "Reschedule for tomorrow. I need to review the numbers for the new project first." Helen nodded, already used to her boss's abrupt decisions. As she typed something into her tablet, Mark continued toward the private elevators. That was when something completely out of place caught his attention. 2 small girls were standing in the middle of the marble lobby. Mark stopped. Helen almost bumped into him. "What is that?" he asked, pointing with his chin. The children looked about 5 years old. They wore cleaning clothes, though they were clean themselves. Each held a small, colorful plastic bucket. The taller one had brown hair tied in a messy braid, while the smaller had blonde curls framing her round face. "I don't know, Mr. Davis. I'll find out immediately," Helen replied, heading toward the girls. Mark should have kept walking. His days were on a tight schedule. Every minute was worth millions. Yet something about that scene kept him rooted to the spot. The girls were looking around, amazed at the vast lobby. The smaller one pointed to the ceiling, where a huge chandelier reflected the light. The older one clutched her bucket as if it were a priceless object. Helen approached them, crouching down. Mark couldn't hear the conversation, but he noticed the girl with the braid gesturing while she spoke, while the curly-haired one hid partially behind her sister. Something about that scene unsettled him. It wasn't anger or irritation, feelings he knew well. It was something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Curious, Mark walked toward the small group. "Hi, and Mommy is very sick," said the girl with the braid as he got closer. "We need to buy her medicine, but it's expensive. We want to clean the floor," the smaller one added, her voice so soft it was barely audible. She held up the little blue bucket. Helen looked up, visibly uncomfortable with her boss's presence. "Mr. Davis, these are Ellie and Sophie," she explained, indicating first the girl with the braid and then the curly-haired one. "They're looking for work." "Work?" Mark repeated, adjusting his glasses. "This isn't a place for kids." Ellie stepped forward, her expression surprisingly serious for someone so young. "Please, sir, we're really good at cleaning. Mommy taught us. And we don't make noise," Sophie added, still partially hiding. Mark felt something strange in his chest, a discomfort he couldn't name. He glanced around and saw a few employees watching. The all-powerful Mark Davis, standing in the middle of the lobby, talking to 2 little girls with buckets. "How did you get in here?" he asked, trying to sound firm. "The man at the door went to get coffee," Ellie answered simply. "He said he'd be right back." Mark mentally noted to speak to the head of security later. "Do you have parents?" "Just Mommy," Sophie said. "She can't work because she's sick." Ellie nodded, her sincere eyes fixed on Mark. "She has a fever and a really bad cough. The doctor said she needs a special medicine," Mark sighed. This was taking far too long. "Helen, call security to escort these children out and see if you can find any guardian." Ellie's eyes went wide. "Please, sir, we just want to help our mum." Mark hesitated for an instant. Something in that child's eyes, a mix of determination and vulnerability that felt vaguely familiar. "This is no place for kids," he repeated more firmly, ignoring the nagging sensation. "Helen, handle this." And with that, he headed toward the elevators, leaving behind the sound of plastic buckets scraping on the marble floor. In the silence of the private elevator, Mark tried to refocus. He had a company to run, important decisions to make. But as the elevator rose silently to the 50th floor, he couldn't shake the image of those eyes, especially Ellie's, the girl with the braid. There was something in them, something that pulled him to a place he didn't want to go. The meeting room on the 50th floor had the best view of Manhattan. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, you could see Central Park stretching like a green rectangle among the skyscrapers. "The numbers from Asia are exceeding expectations," said Richard Barnes, the CFO, pointing to a chart on the screen. Mark nodded, trying to focus, but his mind kept drifting back to the lobby. "Mr. Davis," Richard's voice brought him back to reality. "We need your decision on the investment in the new factory." Mark blinked, realizing everyone in the room was watching him, waiting. "Approved." "Send the details to my email." The executives exchanged glances, surprised by the quick decision on an investment worth hundreds of millions. The rest of the day went on in much the same way. Mark, normally so focused, seemed distant. During a video conference with Berlin, he called the head of operations by the wrong name. In the review of the new project, he caught himself staring out the window, seeing only his own reflection in the glass. "Mr. Davis?" Helen's voice brought him back. She stood in his office doorway, tablet in hand. "What is it?" he asked, more curtly than intended. "The girls, they left. I managed to speak with a neighbor who said their mother really is sick. Pneumonia, apparently." Mark nodded slowly. Why was Helen telling him this, and why did he care? "And—" Helen looked unsettled. "I thought you might want to know. They seemed so—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Determined." Mark adjusted his glasses again, a gesture he made when uncomfortable. "That's not our concern, Helen. There are institutions that handle these situations." "Of course, sir. Sorry to interrupt." When Helen left, Mark spun his chair around to face the Manhattan skyline. How had those two girls gotten in there? What made them think they could just walk into one of New York's most secure buildings and offer cleaning services? Ellie's determined eyes. What distant memory had that stirred? Mark shook his head. He had no time for this. Even so, that night, returning to his luxurious apartment with its panoramic view of the city, Mark felt something different. The nearly 11,000 square foot space had always seemed adequate, a refuge and a symbol of everything he'd achieved. Now, though, the empty spaces screamed silently. The automatic lights turned on as he walked through, revealing pristine rooms no one used, sofas no one sat on, a dining table that never hosted guests. In the kitchen, Mark opened a bottle of expensive wine. He filled a glass and took it out to the balcony. Outside, New York sparkled like a field of fallen stars. His mind was occupied by images he couldn't dismiss. Two small girls with colorful buckets, wanting to clean a skyscraper's floor to buy medicine for their mum. Ridiculous, he muttered to himself. But it wasn't ridiculous. It was moving. It was frightening. It touched something in him that he thought had closed up a long time ago. Reluctantly, Mark allowed himself to remember his own childhood. Not the good part. Joyful moments were few and far between. No, he remembered the need, the lack, the constant feeling of never having enough. Growing up in Pittsburgh's working-class neighborhood wasn't easy. His mother worked 2 jobs. His father, when around, spent any extra money on alcohol. Mark learned early that if he wanted something, he'd have to get it on his own. At 10, he delivered newspapers. By 12, he mowed lawns and washed cars. By 15, he worked part-time at a convenience store after school. Everything to escape, to build something different. And he did. A scholarship to an elite university, his first job at a promising startup. Then he founded his own company. The rest was history. But those girls, and there was something in their determined eyes that took him back. The same desperate will to do anything, anything at all, to change an impossible situation. Mark finished the wine in one gulp and went back inside. He felt restless, uncomfortable in his own skin. He picked up his phone and messaged Helen. "Those girls, did they leave an address or any contact?" The reply came almost immediately. "No, sir, but I have the address the neighbor mentioned." Mark stared at the message for a long moment before replying, "Send it to me." He didn't know what he would do with that information, probably nothing. But for some reason, he needed to have it. That night, Mark Davis, the man who could buy almost anything in the world, couldn't buy himself a peaceful night's sleep. Two pairs of eyes, one determined, one timid, followed him, even in his restless dreams. 3 days later, Mark was in a board meeting when his phone vibrated. A message from Helen. "They're back." No need to explain who they were. "Gentlemen, let's take a 15-minute break," he announced, standing abruptly. The directors exchanged surprised looks. Mark Davis never took breaks. In the elevator, he caught himself adjusting his tie and running a hand through his hair. Why was he nervous? They were just two kids. When the doors opened in the lobby, he spotted them immediately. They were sitting on one of the marble benches near the decorative fountain, still holding their colorful buckets, now with some small cleaning supplies, sponges, rags, and even a tiny squeegee. Ellie was chatting enthusiastically with a security guard, while Sophie stayed quiet, watching everything with wide, curious eyes. Mark approached slowly, and the guard immediately straightened up. "Mr. Davis, I was just—" "It's fine," Mark cut him off, turning to the girls. "You're back." It wasn't a question, but Ellie nodded, a smile lighting up her face. "Mommy's worse," she explained, her smile fading. "We really need that medicine." "She coughs all night," Sophie added softly, looking down at her shoes. Mark felt a pang in his chest, a sensation he didn't quite recognize, or perhaps didn't want to. "How did you get here?" "By bus," Ellie answered proudly. "I know which one to take." Mark pictured the two of them, so small, navigating New York's public transportation alone. It was both disturbing and impressive. "Do you really think you can clean this place?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. Surprisingly, Sophie answered. "We can start with the corners," she said seriously. "That's what Mommy always says." Mark felt an involuntary smile forming at the corners of his mouth. "Helen," he called, and his assistant appeared almost instantly at his side. "Find somewhere these girls can help, and make sure they're paid for their work." Ellie's eyes lit up. "Thank you, sir. We'll make everything shine, I promise." Mark nodded, already turning to return to his meeting. But before he reached the elevator, he looked back one more time. The two girls were being led by Helen to a more secluded area of the lobby. Sophie, the curly-haired one, glanced over her shoulder at him and waved shyly. Mark waved back before he could stop himself. Back in the boardroom, he tried to focus, but his thoughts kept drifting to the lobby, to two little girls with colorful buckets and determined eyes. Who were they? Where did they come from? And why? Despite all logic, did he care? At the end of the meeting, he picked up his phone and sent another message to Helen. Find out more about them. Full names, where they live, who their mother is, everything. The answer came seconds later. "Yes, sir." Mark put the phone away, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Genuine curiosity about other people, and perhaps a first spark of something else, something uncomfortably close to compassion. It was nearly midnight when Helen sent the files to Mark's tablet. He was in his apartment on the balcony, halfway through a glass of whiskey, the city shimmering below. He hadn't been able to focus on work all afternoon, waiting for the information he'd requested. "Attached is what I found about the Miller family," Helen's message read. "The girls will be back tomorrow at 10 a.m. Need anything else, Mr. Davis?" Mark answered with a simple no and opened the file. A folder containing documents, photos, and basic information appeared on the screen. Ellie and Sophie Miller, ages 5 and 4 respectively. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens. They attended the local public school, no father's name on their birth certificates. And the mother. Mark froze as he read the full name, Sarah Elizabeth Miller. The tablet almost slipped from his hands. That couldn't be. He tapped on the photo attached to the report, and his heart raced. The face was older, of course, with subtle lines around the eyes and mouth. The hair was different, shorter, but it was her, undeniably her, Sarah Miller, his Sarah. "Oh my God," Mark whispered into the night air. Memories he had buried deep for 2 decades began to surface, like bubbles rising in a still lake. Pittsburgh, Shadyside neighborhood. He was 16, Sarah was 15. He closed his eyes, letting the images flow. Sarah, with her long brown hair and eyes that always seemed to see through him. Sarah, sitting with him on the curb in front of her house while he explained his grand future plans. Sarah, the only person who never laughed when he said he'd be rich and important one day. "You'll make it, Mark," she had said. "I believe in you." And she truly believed. While teachers wrote him off as just another hopeless case from a poor neighborhood, while his father claimed aiming too high would only bring disappointment, Sarah looked at him with unwavering faith that fueled his dreams. Sarah, who helped him study late at night, flipping through vocabulary flashcards for university entrance exams. Sarah, who celebrated more than anyone when he got the full scholarship to Yale. Sarah, who hugged him on the day he left and said, "Don't forget about us, okay?" And he had promised, sworn he would return, keep in touch, never forget where he came from. But then Yale happened, then an internship in Silicon Valley, then his first startup, then his first millions, and first wealthy friends, and the first public recognition, before he realized he had broken his promise. First, the phone calls became less frequent, then just Christmas cards, until one day he simply stopped, changed his number, moved on, built a new life where Pittsburgh was a distant shadow, a place he preferred to forget, a place where Sarah still lived. Waiting. Mark opened his eyes and looked again at the photo on the screen. Sarah Miller, a single mother, worked as a nurse at a community hospital in Queens until recently falling ill. Diagnosis: severe pneumonia, complicated by a pre-existing lung condition. The girls were right. She really needed medication probably costing more than she could afford. Ellie and Sophie. Sarah's daughters. Mark studied the photos of the children more attentively now. Ellie had her mother's eyes, the same determination he'd known so many years ago. Sophie had Sarah's smile, even if she was shy. A smile he remembered perfectly, though he had tried to forget. "How didn't I see it?" Mark murmured to himself. "How didn't I notice the resemblance?" Maybe because he didn't want to see, maybe because it was easier to treat those kids as strangers, as a problem he could dismiss with a few coins in charity. He stood abruptly, walked to the bar, and refilled his glass of whiskey. Drank it all in one shot, feeling the burn down his throat. Sarah Miller was in New York. Sarah Miller was sick. Sarah Miller had 2 daughters desperate enough to walk into a corporate skyscraper with buckets, and he, Mark Davis, the boy she always believed would do great things, had ignored her existence for 2 decades. He picked up his phone and opened his contact list, looked for the names of the best doctors in the city, thought about sending a medical team to her Queens apartment immediately, thought about depositing a large sum into her bank account, thought of 1,000 solutions involving his money and influence, but not his presence. Then he stopped. No, not this time, not again. Mark placed the phone on the table and returned to the balcony. The night sky was clear, and he could see the distant outline of Queens across the river. Somewhere out there, Sarah Miller was battling an illness, while her daughters roamed the city trying to find ways to help her. Tomorrow, they'd return to his building. Tomorrow, he'd look into those eyes, the ones so much like Sarah's, and know exactly who they were. And then he'd have to face the past he'd tried so hard to leave behind. Mark ran a hand over his face, suddenly feeling much older than his 42 years. He had run away from his origins, from his roots, from his promises. He had become exactly the kind of man younger Mark Davis would have despised, a man who measured people by their market value, not by their character. And now the universe was offering him a second chance, in the form of 2 little girls with colorful buckets. 2 little girls who had no idea that, long ago, their mother was the only person in the world who believed Mark Davis could become someone important. Mark woke before his alarm. In fact, he had barely slept. Discovering that Sarah Miller, his Sarah, was the girl's mother, kept him awake most of the night. He dressed carefully, discarding 3 suits before opting for something simpler: dark jeans and a grey cashmere sweater. Nothing that screamed billionaire, nothing that would create even more distance between them. In the private elevator down to the garage, he rehearsed what he might say. Apologies, explanations, how to sum up 20 years of absence in a few phrases, how to justify breaking the promise he'd made to the only person who ever truly believed in him. His driver was waiting, but Mark dismissed him. "I'll drive today, James." The man looked surprised but handed over the Audi keys without question. Mark hadn't driven in months, maybe years. In New York, it was more practical to have a driver. But today, he needed control, a mechanical distraction, time alone. The address in Queens wasn't in a dangerous neighborhood, but it was certainly modest. Her 4-story brick building with no elevator, a small fire escape out front. Mark parked and sat in the car for a few minutes, breathing deeply. The girls, Ellie and Sophie, had indeed returned to Davis Tower that morning as promised. This time, Mark was waiting for them in the lobby. When they arrived with their buckets, he had a different proposal. "Today, instead of cleaning the floor, how about taking me to visit your mum?" Ellie's eyes widened in surprise. "You want to meet Mommy?" "Actually," Mark replied, feeling a knot in his throat, "I already know her. From a long time ago." Now, standing in front of the building where they lived, Mark tried to calm his nerves. He, the man who closed billion-dollar deals without blinking, was as nervous as a teenager. He finally got out of the car, locked it, and headed for the entrance. 3rd floor, apartment 3B, according to the girls. Climbing the stairs, he noticed the building's condition. Peeling paint, a burnt-out light on the 2nd floor, a loose railing in places. Nothing dangerous, but clear signs of delayed maintenance. The kind of place where people lived not by choice, but by necessity. At 3B, Mark hesitated. Then, before he lost his nerve, he knocked 3 times. Light footsteps approached. A muffled cough. Then the doorknob turned. And there she was. Sarah Miller looked older than in the photo Helen had found. Her face was pale, with dark circles under her eyes. Her brown hair, now with a few grey strands, was pulled back in a messy bun. She wore a simple robe over a t-shirt and pajama pants. She was clearly sick, but her eyes, the ones that always saw him as he really was, still had the same brightness. For a moment, neither spoke. Sarah stared at him, first in confusion, then in a slow recognition that turned into something indescribable. Surprise, joy, and pain all at once. "Mark," her voice came out hoarse, partly from illness, partly from emotion. "Hi, Sarah," he managed, his voice lower than he intended. She leaned against the doorframe, as if she needed support. "How, Sam, how did you—" "Mommy," Ellie's excited voice interrupted. The girls appeared behind Mark, carrying their buckets. "Look who we brought!" Sophie ran forward and hugged her mother's legs. "He owns the big building, Mommy. He gave us work." Sarah looked at her daughters, then at Mark, starting to understand the situation. "You two went to that," she coughed. A deep, worrisome cough. "His building?" Mark nodded, feeling like he was in a dream. "May we come in?" he asked gently. "I think we have a lot to talk about." Sarah hesitated only a second before stepping aside to let them in. "Sure. Sorry about the mess. I haven't had many visitors lately." The apartment was small but clean and organized, considering it housed 2 5-year-olds and a sick mother. The living room connected to the kitchen in an open space. A short hallway likely led to the bedrooms and bathroom. Some toys were scattered around, but someone had tried to tidy them in a box in the corner. "Have a seat," Sarah offered, indicating a well-worn but clean sofa. She herself took a seat in an armchair facing them, with Sophie immediately climbing into her lap. "You went to Mr. Davis's building?" Sarah asked her daughters, her voice a mix of worry and amazement. "Why?" "To clean the floor," Ellie explained simply. "To buy your medicine." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She hugged Sophie tighter and stretched out an arm for Ellie, who came closer. "Oh, my little ones. You shouldn't have. That's so dangerous." "They're fine," Mark assured. "Though, yes, it was a surprise to see 2 kids with buckets in my lobby." Sarah wiped away a tear, then coughed again, turning her head aside. "I'm sorry about this, Mark. Things have been difficult since I lost my job. The hospital made cuts last month and— You don't have to explain, Mark gently interrupted. I understand, but he didn't, not really. How could he? His world stopped, including worries about paying bills or buying medicine a long time ago. Girls, Sarah said, recovering from the cough, why don't you go get that drawing you made yesterday to show Mr. Davis? Ellie and Sophie ran down the hall, leaving the adults alone. A heavy silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just full. Full of unspoken words, lost years, a mutual recognition that something was changing. You look different, Sarah finally said, a slight smile playing on her lips. You look important. Mark shrugged, suddenly self-conscious about his cashmere sweater that probably cost more than a month's rent for this apartment. Appearances can be deceiving. No, you made it. Sarah looked straight at him. I saw you on the news. I felt proud, and I missed you. The sincerity in her voice hit him like a punch. There was no resentment, no accusation, just a simple, honest statement. Mark swallowed hard. I should have stayed in touch. I should have come back, like I promised. Sarah coughed again, more intensely this time. When the fit passed, she looked paler. Mark, you don't need— Yes, I do. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I conquered everything and tried to erase where I came from. I thought it would be easier. She nodded, understanding. But erasing what makes us who we are is never easy. The words hovered between them, filling the space with a truth Mark had avoided for 2 decades. How are your parents? She asked, gently shifting the subject. My father died 5 years ago. Liver issues. I'm sorry. Me too. It was true. Despite everything, Mark regretted not having a better relationship with his father. My mother lives in Florida now. I bought her a house there. Sarah smiled, but the smile was interrupted by another severe coughing fit. She covered her mouth with a handkerchief, and Mark noticed traces of blood when she lowered it. Sarah, you need a doctor. I already saw one, she replied, her voice weaker. But the meds he prescribed— My insurance doesn't cover much since I lost my job and— Mark picked up his phone. I'm calling my personal physician. He'll be here in 30 minutes. Before Sarah could protest, the girls returned, carrying colorful drawings. The moment of confrontation passed, but Mark's concern only grew. Look, Mr. Davis, Ellie held out a sheet of paper. It's the big building where you work. Mark took the drawing. It was Davis Tower, recognizable even in a child's crayon style, a tall rectangle with many windows and the company logo on top. That's very good, Ellie. And this one is yours. Sophie shyly offered her drawing, a stick figure with dark hair, wearing what looked like a suit. Is that me? Mark asked, genuinely touched. Sophie nodded, hiding partially behind the sofa. You're the important man who helped us. Mark felt something break inside him. These children, Sarah's children, saw him as someone good, someone who helped. If only they knew how he had abandoned their mother. Girls, did you have breakfast? Sarah asked, trying to stand but looking dizzy. We ran out of cereal, Mummy, Ellie answered. But it's okay, we're not really hungry. Mark saw the desperate look on Sarah's face, the look of a mother unable to feed her kids. How about we go out for breakfast? He suggested quickly. I know a great place nearby. The girl's eyes lit up. Can we, Mummy? Ellie begged. Sarah looked about to refuse, but another coughing fit seized her, leaving her breathless. Sarah, you need help, Mark insisted, walking over. Let me help, please. Something in his tone, maybe the urgency, maybe the sincerity, made Sarah slowly nod. Okay, she whispered. Thank you. Mark's physician, Dr. Reynolds, arrived 20 minutes later. He was a middle-aged man with an expensive leather bag and gentle manners. He examined Sarah in the bedroom, while Mark entertained the girls in the living room, showing them games on his phone. Does she have any other relatives? Mark asked Ellie while they waited. An aunt to take care of you when Mommy's not well. Ellie shook her head. No. Grandma went to heaven last year, it's just us. Mark nodded, processing the information. Sarah was alone, raising 2 small daughters with no support network in an expensive city like New York. When Dr. Reynolds came out of the bedroom, his expression was serious. He beckoned Mark to one side. "Mr. Davis, your friend has a severe pneumonia, complicated by an old lung injury. She needs immediate hospitalization." "Make the arrangements," Mark replied without hesitation. "Private hospital, best room available, all expenses on me." The doctor nodded, accustomed to Mark's efficiency. "And the children?" he asked, glancing at Ellie and Sophie, now drawing at the kitchen table. Mark hadn't thought about that. There were no relatives, no aunt to temporarily take them in. Social services would probably separate them into different foster homes. "I'll take care of them," he said, surprised by his own decision, but knowing instinctively it was right. Dr. Reynolds looked skeptical. "Mr. Davis, with all due respect, your lifestyle isn't exactly—" "I'll make whatever adjustments are necessary," Mark interrupted. "The girls will stay with me while Sarah is in the hospital." After the doctor left to make the arrangements, Mark went into the bedroom to speak with Sarah. She was propped against the pillows, looking even more fragile in the direct light. "Doctor, Reynolds wants to take you to the hospital," Mark informed, sitting on the edge of the bed. Sarah closed her eyes. "I can't afford that, Mark. And the girls." "All expenses are covered," he reassured her. "And as for the girls, if you allow it, they can stay with me until you recover." Sarah opened her eyes, surprised. "With you? Mark, you haven't seen me in 20 years, and now you want to take care of my kids." The question was fair. More than fair. "I know I don't deserve your trust," he admitted, "but I promise to take good care of them. They'll be my top priority, and you can talk to them every day by video." He paused. "Please, Sarah, let me do this. Let me fix a little of what I broke." Sarah studied him for a long moment. Even ill-tone, her eyes had that penetrating quality that always made him feel she could see through his defenses. "They like you," she finally said. "That means a lot to me." Another pause. "All right, Mark. I trust you to care for them, but promise, you'll let them be kids. No full-time nannies or fancy schools all of a sudden. Just let them be who they are. I promise," he said, taking her hand, noticing how hot it felt from the fever. 2 hours later, a private ambulance took Sarah to New York Presbyterian, where a team of specialists was already waiting. Mark stayed behind with Ellie and Sophie, helping them pack a small bag of clothes and favorite toys. "Is Mommy going to get better?" Sophie asked, her tiny voice trembling as she hugged a worn-out stuffed bunny. Mark crouched down to her eye level. "The doctors will take very good care of her," he promised, "and meanwhile, you'll stay with me." "It'll be like an adventure." Ellie, more perceptive, watched Mark with a seriousness beyond her years. "You knew Mommy before, didn't you? From when you were kids?" Mark nodded, surprised at the girl's insight. "Yes, Ellie. Your mom was my best friend for a long time." "And then you got lost?" Sophie asked. Mark took a deep breath. "I got lost," he corrected gently. "Your mommy always knew exactly who she was." As he watched the girls finish packing their things in the small apartment, surrounded by signs of a difficult life, piles of unpaid bills, medicine, well cared for but obviously worn clothes, Mark felt the full weight of the emptiness he'd left behind. It wasn't just Sarah he'd abandoned. It was the chance to be part of something real, something genuine. The chance to keep his roots, to remember where he came from, who helped him get there. Now, looking at her daughters, children who could have easily been his as well in another life, another path, Mark realized how much he'd lost in his pursuit to become someone important. He had conquered the world, as he'd planned. But the price was leaving behind the only person who ever truly believed he could. The private elevator of the Wellington building ascended silently, carrying 3 people whose lives couldn't have been more different until just a few hours ago. Mark Davis stared at the changing digital floor numbers, while Ellie and Sophie, each holding a small backpack, watched the lit buttons with fascination. "Is your building taller than your office?" Ellie asked, breaking the silence. "No," Mark replied, "but I live on the top floor." Sophie moved closer to the elevator's mirrored wall, staring at her own reflection. "It's pretty here," she said softly. Mark just nodded, his mind still on the hospital where they'd left Sarah 3 hours earlier. The doctors used technical terms, Bilateral pneumonia, low oxygen saturation, possible ventilator support. He understood the words, but what he really understood was the fear in her eyes when she said goodbye to her daughters. It'll just be a few days, he had promised, though he didn't know if that was true. What on earth was he doing? Mark Davis, CEO of Davis Enterprises, the man who handled boardroom meetings with a firm hand, who made multi-million-dollar deals without hesitation, would now be responsible for 2 children, ages 4 and 5, who he barely knew. The elevator stopped smoothly on the 47th floor. The doors opened directly into the foyer of his apartment. "Wow!" Ellie exclaimed, eyes wide. "And you live here by yourself?" "Yes," Mark answered, keying in a code on the security panel next to the door. "Just me." "Aren't you scared?" asked Sophie, gripping her backpack more tightly. The question caught him off guard. Scared? Of what? "Of the dark," Sophie explained, interpreting his confusion. "Of nighttime." Mark wasn't sure how to respond. He'd never thought about it. Fear of the dark was as distant from his daily concerns as taking care of 2 small children. "You must be hungry," he said, changing the subject as he guided them inside. Mark's apartment occupied the entire floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Manhattan. The decor was minimalist, shades of grey, white, and black, Italian designer furniture, contemporary art pieces on the walls. There were no personal photos, no toys, no sign anyone truly lived there. The girls stopped in the entrance of the main living area, clearly impressed and a bit intimidated. "You can come in," Mark encouraged. "Make yourselves at home." Sophie took 2 hesitant steps on the polished marble floor, then stopped again. "It's slippery," she noted, concerned. "And there's no color," Ellie added, looking around. "Your house is all grey." Mark looked at his own apartment through their eyes for the first time and realized how cold and impersonal it truly was. Clinically perfect, aesthetically pleasing, entirely lifeless. "Why are there no photos?" Ellie asked, pointing at a wall where an expensive abstract painting hung. "I don't take many photos," Mark replied, suddenly defensive. "Mommy has photos of us everywhere," Sophie said, "even in the bathroom." Mark led them down the hallway toward the bedrooms. His apartment had 4 suites, but only one was used. The others remained pristine, like hotel rooms awaiting guests who never arrived. "You can choose which room you want," he offered, opening the doors one by one. The girls peeked into each room, all decorated in the same minimalist style, with huge king-size beds that looked like oceans for their small bodies. "Can we stay in the same room?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "I don't like sleeping alone." "Sure," Mark responded quickly, relieved they wouldn't occupy separate rooms. "You can stay together." They chose the room with the best view of Central Park. Mark placed their small backpacks on the enormous bed. "We'll get your things organized and then eat something." "Sound good." The girls agreed, but their movements were restrained as though they were afraid to touch anything or make noise. This behavior, so different from the natural exuberance they showed in their own apartment, bothered Mark. "You can jump on the bed if you want," he suddenly said, "and shout too." "It's okay." Ellie and Sophie exchanged uncertain looks. "Are you sure?" Ellie asked. "Absolutely." Still hesitant, Ellie climbed onto the bed and gave a small hop. When Mark didn't protest, she jumped higher. Sophie soon joined, and within seconds they were bouncing and laughing, the sound echoing through an apartment that had never heard children's laughter before. Something inside Mark relaxed as he watched. The sound of giggles filled the empty space, momentarily transforming the showroom into something closer to a home. Mark's kitchen was a monument to modern technology. Top-of-the-line appliances gleamed under built-in lighting, all impeccably clean, most rarely used. He usually ordered from gourmet restaurants or ate out. "What do you usually eat for dinner?" he asked, opening the nearly empty fridge. "Some bottles of water, a bottle of champagne, a few lemons." "Noodles with red sauce," Ellie answered promptly. "It's the best in the world." "Especially when Mommy puts cheese on top," Sophie added, now chattier in the new environment. Mark stared at the empty fridge. No noodles, no sauce, no cheese. I guess we'll have to order in, he admitted. Do you like Italian food? I know a great restaurant that delivers. The girls nodded eagerly. Mark grabbed his phone and placed the order: spaghetti with tomato sauce for the kids, a Caesar salad for himself. While they waited, he realized he needed far more than just food to properly care for them. Do you need anything special for bedtime? He asked. Any ritual? Ellie thought for a moment. Mommy always reads us a story before bed, she explained, and leaves a little light on for Sophie. And brushes our hair 100 times, Sophie added. So it's shiny like the sun. Mark made a mental note: story, nightlight, hair brushing. I have some books, he said, though he knew his books, mainly business biographies and economic treatises, would hardly interest small children. We brought our favorite, Ellie said, running back to the bedroom. She returned with a thin, worn book, its pages soft from frequent use. It's called The Giving Tree. Mommy says it's both sad and happy. Mark took the book, vaguely recalling the story of a tree that gives everything to a boy it loves. He agreed to read it later, but mentally noted to buy more children's books as soon as possible. Dinner arrived, and he faced a new challenge: setting the table for children. His fine porcelain plates and heavy silver utensils seemed unsuitable for small hands. Still, he had no alternative. Careful, it's hot, he warned, spooning smaller portions onto the expensive plates. Sophie looked at the huge silver fork, clearly intimidated. It's too big, she said. Mark improvised, finding dessert spoons that felt more manageable. The girls ate hungrily, though they made a small mess on the imported Italian tablecloth. Mark discovered he didn't mind. After dinner, the next challenge: bath time. He guided the girls to the bathroom in the suite, featuring a huge whirlpool tub he'd never used this way. Can you wash yourselves? He asked, and unsure of his role in the process. I help Sophie, Ellie replied seriously. But Mommy always checks if we washed behind our ears. Mark filled the tub with warm water, found a mild soap he hoped was okay for kids, and let them wash, checking occasionally. The luxury bath products he kept, elegant black packaging with French names, felt entirely inappropriate for children. After their bath, the girls wore the pajamas they'd brought. Simple but clean, already a bit small for them. Sophie's had unicorn prints. Ellie's had stars and rockets. Mark felt a pang realizing how personal these items were, contrasting with the monochromatic background of his apartment. Now what? He asked, realizing he had no clue what to do with two clean, well-fed children for the remaining hours before bedtime. Ellie looked around the spacious living room, her eyes settling on the large designer sofas. Can we build a fort? She asked hesitantly. Fort. With sheets and pillows, Sophie explained excitedly. Mommy always does that when it rains. Mark tried to picture his Egyptian cotton sheets draped over his designer furniture, forming makeshift tents. The idea seemed absurd. Then again, what else would he do with them? Show them financial spreadsheets? Okay, he agreed. Let's build a fort. The smiles that lit up their faces were worth every cent of his expensive sheets. For the next hour, Mark Davis, the man who ran a global enterprise, took orders from two little girls on the correct way to position sheets over chairs and the sofa to create the perfect ceiling for the fort. Silk pillows were arranged on the floor as beds. Plastic cups, the only ones he found, became phones for imaginary conversations. You have to hold it like this, Ellie instructed, demonstrating how to hold the cup to her ear. Then speak loudly so the other person can hear. Mark obeyed, feeling ridiculous as he spoke into a cup, yet oddly liberated. Hello, who's speaking? He said into the makeshift phone. It's the king of the magic mountain, Sophie answered from her own cup, her little voice brimming with authority. We need more pillows in the kingdom. Mark couldn't help but laugh, a sound his apartment rarely heard. He fetched more pillows, including some decorative ones never really used, only placed decoratively by his interior designer. Inside the sheet fort, sitting awkwardly on the floor with his legs crossed, Mark listened to the fantastic stories the girls invented, about magical kingdoms, warrior princesses, and friendly dragons. Occasionally, they included him in the tale, usually as a kindly giant guarding the treasure. You're really tall, Sophie observed, looking at him with admiration. Taller than everyone, Ellie nodded, then got serious. When is Mommy coming back? The question caught Mark off guard. He fiddled with the edge of a sheet, buying time. The doctors are taking really good care of her, he finally replied, but she has to stay in the hospital until she's strong again. What if she doesn't get better? Sophie's voice was almost a whisper. Mark's heart tightened. How could he reassure them about a fear he himself shared? Your mother is very strong, he said, choosing his words carefully. She wants to come back to you more than anything in the world. Ellie studied his face, as if searching for lies. Promise you won't leave us? The question was so simple and direct, it hit Mark like a train. These children had already lost so much. Their grandmother recently, now their mother temporarily hospitalized. Their fear of abandonment was palpable. I promise, he answered, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. I'm not going anywhere. Sophie crawled onto his lap without warning. She was so light, so small against his large frame. Instinctively, Mark wrapped an arm around her, feeling her soft breathing against his chest. You smell different from Daddy, she murmured sleepily. Mark froze. You met your dad? Ellie, who was arranging pillows, shook her head. No, he left before I was born. But sometimes Mommy talks about him. She said he smelled like cinnamon and wood. Mark processed this, wondering what kind of man would leave Sarah to raise 2 daughters alone. He felt a stab of guilt, remembering that he too had abandoned her years earlier. It's getting late, he said gently. I think it's time for a story and then bed. Mark carried Sophie, nearly asleep, to the bedroom. Ellie followed, yawning but insisting she wasn't tired. He placed them on the big bed, feeling awkward as he adjusted pillows and pulled up blankets. The light, Sophie reminded, her eyes already closing. Mark found a small lamp on the nightstand and left it on. Then he picked up The Giving Tree and began to read. The story was simple but profound, about giving and receiving unconditional love, the cycle of life. As he read, Mark felt the irony. He was like the boy, who took everything from the tree without giving anything in return. Sarah and these girls were like the tree, offering him something he hadn't known he needed. By the time he finished, Sophie was sound asleep. Ellie was fighting off sleep, her eyes heavy. Mark, she mumbled. Yes? Did you like our fort? He smiled, genuinely. It was the best fort I've ever seen. Can we make another one tomorrow? She asked, finally closing her eyes. Sure. Mark sat there a few more minutes, watching the 2 girls sleep in the huge bed. Their faces relaxed in slumber, confident they were safe, that someone was caring for them. The responsibility weighed on him like never before. He rose quietly and left the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. In the living room, he gazed at the mess they'd made. Expensive sheets rumpled, pillows scattered, plastic cups on the floor. Normally, he would have called the cleaning service immediately. Today, he decided to leave everything as it was. The imperfect fort, built with laughter and imagination, seemed like the only genuine object in his magazine-worthy apartment. Checking his phone, he saw dozens of unread emails, missed calls, and text messages. The world he'd built kept spinning, demanding his attention. But for the first time in years, Mark felt no urgency to respond. Instead, he sat on the sofa and picked up a notepad. He began making a list. Kids' plates and utensils, storybooks, new clothes, check sizes, toys. Food kids eat nightlight for bedroom. The list kept growing. The more he thought, the more he realized how unprepared he was to care for 2 children. He had no idea which foods were suitable, what routines they should follow, how to handle childhood illnesses or nightmares. Mark Davis, the man who planned billion-dollar corporate acquisitions with ease, now faced his biggest challenge, creating a welcoming environment for 2 vulnerable little girls. He picked up his phone and sent a message to Helen. I need to cancel all meetings this week. Personal situation. Also need you to arrange some things for the apartment first thing tomorrow. He attached the list he'd made, adding, anything else kids ages 4 and 5 might need. Helen's reply came almost immediately, showing why she was such a valuable assistant. Understood. Reorganizing your schedule now. Items will be delivered before 8 a.m. Will include some extra suggestions. Need help with the children? Mark considered. It would be easier to hire a professional nanny, someone who knew what they were doing, but somehow that felt wrong. He'd promised Sarah he would personally take care of her daughters, and, surprisingly, he'd enjoyed the last few hours despite the anxiety and uncertainty. "No, thank you. I can take care of them." He turned off his phone and went back to the bedroom door, looking once more at the two small figures asleep. Tomorrow, he'd visit Sarah in the hospital. He'd have to deal with impatient investors and delayed projects. He'd have to figure out how to make pancakes or whatever children ate for breakfast. But for now, Mark Davis, the giant guardian of the treasure, according to Ellie and Sophie's stories, just watched, amazed by the simplicity and depth of what he was feeling. For the first time in years, Mark didn't feel alone in his apartment. The girl's presence had transformed the space into something else, something imperfect, messy, and infinitely more alive. The man who'd built a financial empire had spent the night building a sheet fort, and surprisingly, the second achievement seemed far more meaningful than the first. Presbyterian Hospital was one of the best in New York, reflected in the understated luxury of the private room where Sarah was admitted. Unlike the public wards with their curtain dividers and relentless fluorescent lights, here there was privacy, a view of the park, and even fresh flowers, something Mark suspected Dr. Reynolds had arranged at his request. Mark paused in the doorway, observing Sarah before announcing himself. She seemed to be sleeping, connected to a heart monitor and an oxygen tube. Her face was still pale, but no longer that frighteningly grayish tone from 3 days ago. The doctors said she was responding well to antibiotics, though she'd need at least another week in the hospital. He cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle her. "Mark?" Sarah opened her eyes, voice still hoarse. A small smile formed when she saw him. "You came." "Of course I did," he said, stepping closer. He placed a small vase of daisies on the bedside table. "The girls made a card, but I left it in the car. I'm a bit," he gestured vaguely, "disorganized lately." Sarah's smile grew as she studied him. Mark looked quite different from the immaculate businessman he used to be. He wore jeans and a simple blue t-shirt, both slightly wrinkled. His hair, usually perfectly styled, was messy, as if he'd run his hands through it several times. Shadows under his eyes hinted at sleepless nights. But there was something else, a relaxation in his shoulders, a softness in his gaze she hadn't seen since they were teenagers. "You're taking good care of them?" she asked, motioning for him to sit in the chair beside the bed. Mark let out a light laugh, sitting down. "I think they're taking care of me." Another moment of silence passed, not awkward, just full, filled with unsaid words, lost years, a mutual sense that something was shifting. "Sophie had a nightmare last night," Mark went on. "I woke up to her calling for you at 3 in the morning. Scared me to death. I thought something terrible had happened." He shook his head, remembering. "She was so frightened. Something about a giant monster wanting to take you away. I ended up sleeping on the floor beside their bed." "How did you handle it?" Sarah asked, curious. "Well, first I checked under the bed, in the closets, behind the curtains, the whole routine," Mark replied with a little smile. "Then I made up a story on the spot about a monster who just wanted friends, but didn't know how to ask. In the end, we made monster spray with water and a bit of perfume in a spray bottle." Sarah laughed, triggering a brief cough. When she recovered, her eyes shone with amusement. "Looks like you're becoming an expert." "Far from it," Mark admitted, ruffling his already messy hair. "Yesterday morning, while I was making pancakes, which, by the way, looked more like cement, Ellie asked why I never had kids. I almost burned down the entire kitchen." "And what did you say?" Sarah asked softly. Mark was silent for a moment, gazing at the gray sky outside the window. "I said I never found the time," he finally answered. "But the truth is, I never found the space. In my heart, I mean." He turned back to her. "I built everything around me to keep people away. For even my apartment, you should have seen how the girls looked at it on the first day, like it was a museum where they weren't allowed to touch anything. And now, Mark smiled, genuinely. Now it looks like a disaster scene. There are drawings on the fridge, a permanent fort in the living room, and so many toys that I nearly broke my neck tripping over a plastic unicorn last night." Sarah smiled, and despite her illness and fatigue, Mark noticed she was still beautiful. Not the superficial beauty that dominated his world now, but a deeper kind of beauty. A beauty that came from within. "I still can't believe they went to your building with buckets," Sarah said, shaking her head slightly. "I couldn't figure out why they seemed so familiar," Mark confessed. "Especially Ellie. That determined look." "She looks like me at that age," Sarah confirmed. "But the stubbornness—" She paused, studying Mark. "She got that from you." Mark raised his eyebrows in surprise. "From me? Don't you remember how stubborn you were? I'm going to leave this place, Sarah. I'm going to build something big. I'm going to show them all." You repeated that like a mantra, Mark remembered. The two of them sitting on the curb in front of her house, sharing dreams and plans. He was full of ambition and anger. She was full of hope and faith. Two teenagers who thought they could figure out the world. "And I did," he said quietly. "I did exactly what I promised." "Yes," Sarah agreed. "You did." Another silence settled between them, heavier this time. "But at what cost?" Mark murmured, almost to himself. Sarah reached out her hand and Mark took it without hesitation. Her skin was warm, probably from lingering fever, but her grip was steady. "It's never too late, Mark," she said softly. "To change, to find space." Mark felt something break and rebuild inside him, like a wave crashing on the shore only to reform in the sea. He looked at their intertwined hands, hers small, his large, and felt a certainty he hadn't known in years. "Thank you for never forgetting me," he said, voice low but clear. Sarah squeezed his hand gently. "How could I?" They stayed like that for a long moment, connected by their hands, by shared memories, by an understanding that transcended words. Outside, the city continued its frenetic pace, indifferent. In the quiet of that hospital room, something old was being renewed, and something new was beginning to grow. Mark realized that for years he had equated success with acquisitions, companies, properties, bank accounts. Now beside that hospital bed, holding the hand of the woman who had once been his best friend, he began to understand that real success was more about connections than collections. The girls were right. They were taking care of him far more than he was taking care of them. And for the first time since leaving Pittsburgh, Mark Davis felt truly at home. "Uncle Mark, is breakfast ready?" Ellie's voice echoed through the apartment, snapping Mark out of his light sleep. He opened his eyes, momentarily confused. He'd slept on the sofa again, surrounded by colorful drawings and a pile of children's books. On the coffee table, his laptop still displayed unanswered emails. "Uncle Mark," Ellie appeared in the doorway, already dressed, hair a mess. "Sophie's hungry. I am too." Mark sat up, rubbing his eyes. A week had passed since he'd brought the girls to his apartment. A week that had turned his life upside down. "I'm coming," he said, stifling a yawn. "What do you want today? Cereal? Toast?" "Pancakes!" Sophie appeared behind her sister, clutching her worn-out plush bunny. "With a happy face on them, like yesterday." Mark smiled. His cooking skills were still limited, but he'd mastered a few basics, including pancakes with fruit to make smiley faces, quickly becoming the girls' favorite breakfast. "Happy face pancakes it is," he agreed, getting up. "But first, someone needs to brush their teeth." The two girls raced to the bathroom, vying to get there first. Mark followed more slowly, pausing to appreciate all the changes in his apartment. What had once been a minimalist, immaculate space now felt alive. The girls' drawings decorated the walls, taped up here and there. Colorful toys occupied corners where abstract sculptures once sat. The sheet fort had become a permanent structure, now reinforced with cushions and fairy lights. In the kitchen, Mark prepared pancake batter as he listened to the girls argue about which toothbrush was best. He moved with a newfound familiarity, finding utensils and ingredients without searching. When Helen had sent children's supplies on that first morning, Mark had felt completely lost. Now, just a week later, he was establishing a routine. "Can I help?" Ellie entered the kitchen, climbing onto a small stool Mark had bought so the girls could reach the counter. "Sure." Mark handed her a wooden spoon. "Stir the batter while I cut fruit for the faces." As they worked side by side, Mark noticed how much Ellie resembled Sarah, not just physically but in her determination and practical approach. Sophie, on the other hand, was more dreamy, more sensitive. They complemented each other perfectly. "Uncle Mark," Ellie suddenly said, focusing on stirring the batter, "are you going to be our dad now?" The question caught him completely off guard. Mark nearly dropped the knife he was using to slice strawberries. "No, Ellie," he answered carefully. "You already have a wonderful mom who'll be home soon. I'm just helping for now." Ellie nodded, processing his words. "But you can still be our uncle, right? Even when Mommy comes home." Mark felt a familiar tightness in his chest, a feeling he was growing used to with the girls around. "If you want," he replied honestly, "I'd love to still be your uncle." The smile Ellie gave him was worth more than any business deal he had ever closed. After breakfast, Mark glanced at his watch. Under normal circumstances, he would have been in his office for hours, running meetings, making big decisions. Instead, he found himself on the floor of his living room, helping Sophie assemble a unicorn puzzle, while Ellie drew on the other side of the coffee table. His phone rang. It was Helen. "Mr. Davis, the investors are worried about your prolonged absence. The board is requesting an emergency meeting." Mark looked at the girls, engrossed in their activities. A week ago, he would have dropped everything to rush to the office. "Tell the board the meeting will be by video conference tomorrow afternoon," he said. "And Helen, please cancel all business trips for the next month." "But sir, the trip to Tokyo can be postponed," Mark interrupted gently. "I have more important commitments now." When he hung up, he saw Sophie watching him with her big, observant eyes. "Are you sad, Uncle Mark?" "No," he answered honestly. "Why do you ask?" "You were smiling, but your eyes got sad when the phone rang." Mark was taken aback by her perception. It was true that part of him missed the rhythm and adrenaline of work. But another part, a part growing each day, had discovered a different, deeper fulfillment in these simple hours with the girls. "I'm not sad," he assured her, "just thinking about many things at once." "Mommy says when your head is too full, you need to dance," Ellie chimed in, standing up. "Uncle Mark, do you know how to dance?" Before he could answer, Ellie ran to the built-in sound system on the wall and started pressing random buttons. After some confusion, soft music filled the apartment. "That's old people music," Ellie declared in disgust. "We need jumping music." Mark chuckled and, to the girls' surprise, took the remote and switched to a pop station. An upbeat track blasted from the speakers. "Is this better?" he asked, turning up the volume. What followed was one of the most ridiculous and liberating things Mark had ever done. He, who refused to dance even at social events, found himself jumping and spinning around the living room with two little girls. Sophie giggled hysterically as he lifted her up, and Ellie created a dance routine consisting mostly of twirls and stomps. When the music finally ended, the three collapsed on the sofa, panting and laughing. "You dance funny, Uncle Mark," Sophie said between giggles. "Thank you, I think," he replied, realizing he didn't mind looking ridiculous at all. That night, after the girls had finally gone to sleep, after 2 stories and several just 5 more minutes negotiations, Mark sat on the balcony with a glass of wine. The city sparkled before him, the same view he always had, but it looked different now. He took out the little card Sophie had made for her mom. Colorful drawings framed the simple message, "Get better soon, Mommy. We and Uncle Mark are waiting for you." Uncle Mark. The title still sounded strange, but in a good way, comforting. His phone, purposely on silent, blinked with notifications of urgent emails and messages. But for the first time in years, Mark felt no urgency to answer them. Tomorrow he planned to take the girls to their apartment to pick up more clothes and toys. He thought of doing something special, maybe cleaning the place, getting it ready for when Sarah returned. It was the least he could do. Mark Davis, who once lived for the next big deal, for the next corporate milestone, now found himself planning how to make a kid's bedroom look more inviting. He looked at his tie, tossed over a chair for days, unused, his neglected phone, his schedule, reorganized around mealtimes and naps instead of meetings and conferences. He was changing. Or maybe, this thought surprised him, maybe he was just returning to who he really was before the corporate world turned him into someone else, a man who felt, a man who was present, a man who finally understood that some things can't be bought, sold, or negotiated. They can only be lived moment by moment, with a fully open heart. "Is she really coming home?" Sophie asked for the third time that morning, her eyes shining with hope as Mark fastened her seatbelt. "Yes, Princess," Mark replied with a smile. "Dr. Reynolds said your mom is much better and can come home in 2 days." Next to her, Ellie was properly buckled in, holding a list written in childish handwriting. "We have to clean everything," she declared with the seriousness of a project manager, "and buy groceries, and flowers. Mommy loves flowers. And warm bread," Sophie added. "She always says a house that smells like bread is a happy house." Mark nodded, starting the car. The 2 weeks since he'd brought the girls to his apartment had been transformative. The routine they'd developed was surprisingly comfortable. Pancake breakfasts, daily hospital visits, nights of reading and makeshift forts. But now Sarah was better, overcoming the pneumonia that nearly took her life. It was time to prepare her home for her return. "What do you think about making a big surprise for Mommy?" Mark suggested as he drove toward Queens. "Making everything perfect for when she arrives," the girls agreed enthusiastically, already sharing ideas. Mark smiled, watching them through the rearview mirror. Ellie and Sophie had become so important to him that he could hardly recall what life was like before they came along. It was as if he had discovered color in a world he previously saw only in black and white. Sarah's apartment was exactly as they'd left it 2 weeks ago. Small, simple, but with an indefinable warmth that made it a real home. Unlike his own luxurious apartment, this place told stories, photos on the walls, kids' drawings on the fridge, plants on the windowsills. "Where do we start?" Mark asked, assessing the work ahead. "First we make a list," Ellie replied promptly, pulling a notebook from her backpack. Mark smiled. Ellie was as organized as he was, something he suspected she inherited from Sarah. Under Ellie's watchful eye, they divided tasks. Mark took care of high-up stuff, cleaning the ceiling, changing light bulbs, reaching high shelves. Sophie took care of making it pretty, arranging flowers, putting up new drawings on the fridge, and Ellie coordinated everything, plus helped with general cleaning. "Uncle Mark," Sophie called, holding an empty vase. "Can we buy daisies?" "They're Mommy's favorite." "Of course," he replied, realizing how little he knew about Sarah's preferences now. What else did she love? What made her smile? Questions he hadn't asked in over 20 years, when they were inseparable. They worked all morning, cleaning every corner of the small apartment. Mark was impressed with the girls' diligence, especially given their ages. They didn't complain or ask for breaks. They were driven by love for their mom and the anticipation of her return. Around noon, they paused to eat the sandwiches they'd brought, sitting on the living room floor with the spring breeze flowing in through the open windows. They looked like a little family. "Uncle Mark," Ellie asked between bites, "did you know this house before?" Mark shook his head. "No, I'd never been here until you two brought me." "But you knew Mommy when you were little, right?" Sophie pressed. "Yes," Mark confirmed, feeling that familiar pang of guilt. "We were best friends when we were about twice your ages." "So why did you stop being friends?" Ellie asked, direct as ever. Mark took a deep breath, searching for an honest but age-appropriate explanation. "I moved away for school. Then I got busy building my company." He paused. "I should have kept in touch." It was a big mistake not to. The girls watched him for a moment, taking in his words. "But now you came back," Sophie concluded, as if that settled everything. Maybe it did, Mark thought. Maybe it really was that simple in a child's logic. You make a mistake, acknowledge it and move on. Without the layers of guilt, regret and excuses adults accumulate over the years. "Yes," he agreed, smiling at her. "Now I'm back." Then after lunch, they got back to work. Mark found a few structural issues in the apartment he decided to fix. A dripping faucet, a window that wouldn't close properly, a loose step on the back stairs leading to the yard. Years of managing properties had given him enough knowledge for small repairs, and he'd brought tools, anticipating the need. "Wow, Uncle Mark, you can fix things," Sophie exclaimed, watching him tighten the window screws. "My dad was a building superintendent," Mark explained, surprised to share something he rarely mentioned. "He taught me a lot when I was a kid." "Our grandpa?" Ellie asked, curious. The question startled him. The girls were, in a way, weaving connections in their minds between his past and their present, as though it was natural for all these parts of his life to intertwine. "Yes," he said simply. "Are your grandfather—" While Mark finished repairs, the girls decided to make welcome posters. Sophie, in particular, was determined to create something special. "Can we write on the wall?" she asked, showing Mark a box of colored chalk. "On the wall?" Mark repeated, unsure. "Yes, Mommy lets us draw on that wall," Ellie explained, pointing to a section of the living room painted with chalkboard paint. "It's our special wall." Mark smiled in relief. For a moment, he imagined Sophie doodling with permanent markers on newly cleaned walls. "In that case, I think it's a great idea." Sophie concentrated on her masterpiece, carefully writing "Welcome home, Mommy," in big, colorful letters surrounded by hearts, flowers, and what appeared to be 3 stick figures, 2 small and 1 large, holding hands. Seeing the girls occupied, Mark decided to organize Sarah's bedroom. It was the one place they'd barely touched, wanting to respect her privacy. But at least clean sheets and fresh air were in order. The room was simple yet cozy. A double bed with a floral quilt, a small vanity, an old wardrobe, and a dresser. On the walls were more photos, mostly of the girls at various ages, and some of an older woman Mark assumed was Sarah's mother, now gone. While changing the sheets, he noticed one dresser drawer was slightly open, something stuck inside preventing it from closing. Reluctantly, but worried it might be important, he opened it further to fix the issue. It was a drawer of personal items, letters, cards, little keepsakes, the kind of things people save for sentimental value. The object preventing the drawer from closing was a small wooden box, shifted out of place. Mark picked up the box to reposition it and noticed its lid was loose. Unintentionally, a few items fell back into the open drawer: a vintage brooch, a colorful beaded bracelet, and an old, faded photograph face down. Gathering the fallen items, Mark flipped the photo over and froze. It was them, Sarah and him as teenagers, sitting on the curb in front of her Pittsburgh home. He must have been 16, tall, skinny, awkward, with hair longer than he'd ever wear now. Sarah was maybe 14 or 15, with braided hair and a smile that lit up her face. They were side by side, shoulders touching, laughing at something long forgotten. His hands trembling slightly, Mark turned the photo over. On the back, in the rounded handwriting he would recognize anywhere, was a short phrase: "My best friend." Something inside him shattered. Suddenly, he was on his knees on the floor, still holding that photo, tears coming without warning or control. There was the physical evidence of what he'd abandoned, not just a friendship, but a fundamental connection to who he was. Sarah had kept him alive in her memory, preserving this photo like a treasure, even after he left her behind without looking back. While he built his empire, closed deals, amassed millions, she held on to this simple photograph, this reminder of a boy who promised to return and never did. Mark wept silently, alone in that room, clutching the physical memory of who he once was. He cried not only out of regret but also out of gratitude, for still having a chance, for her having kept him even as he forgot her. The girls' happy voices in the yard brought Mark back to the present. He quickly wiped his tears and gently placed the photo back in the box, returning it to the drawer. But he knew the image and what it represented would stay with him forever. Taking a deep breath, he went to the window. Down in the small yard, Ellie and Sophie were on an old tire swing hanging from the lone tree. They laughed and shouted, taking turns pushing each other. The scene instantly transported him to his past. He and Sarah, not much older than Ellie, playing in a similar park. Sarah always urging him to go higher, not to be afraid. Always believing he could do anything. "You'll make it, Mark, I believe in you." Words spoken over 20 years ago but now echoing as if she were beside him. Words that shaped his life more than any business book or mentor he'd ever had. Without a second thought, Mark went downstairs and out to the yard. "Uncle Mark," Sophie yelled when she saw him. "Come play with us." Mark glanced at his watch, an automatic habit, and then, in a deliberate gesture, removed it from his wrist and slid it into his pocket. "What are we playing?" he asked, stepping closer. "Astronauts in space," Ellie explained, pointing to the tire swing. "The tire is our spaceship, and that corner is the space station," Sophie added, pointing to a collection of boxes and wood scraps arranged under the tree. "Can I be an astronaut too?" Mark asked, feeling unexpectedly shy, as if asking to join an exclusive club. The girls exchanged looks, as if evaluating whether he was qualified. "You have to wear the safety helmet," Ellie finally decided, handing him an upside-down plastic bucket. Mark, who led board meetings with unshakable authority, obediently placed the helmet on his head. Then, under the detailed instructions of two commanders aged 5 and 4D, he embarked on a backyard space mission. They hopped around space, the lawn, collected alien samples, leaves and small stones, and faced a meteor storm, Sophie throwing crumpled paper. At one point, while fixing the space station, renailing a loose board on the old playhouse, Mark found himself laughing, not the polite laugh of social events, but a real belly laugh coming from deep inside. He couldn't recall the last time he'd laughed like that. The sun was starting to set when they finally flopped onto the grass, exhausted from their space adventure. Sophie rested her head on Mark's lap, while Ellie carefully dismantled the space station. "Will Mummy like the surprise?" Sophie asked, looking at the sky as the first stars appeared. "She'll love it," Mark assured, gently stroking her hair. "You two did an amazing job." What they'd done went far beyond cleaning. They had turned an empty space into a home again. They hadn't just fixed things, they'd filled every corner with love and anticipation. Sitting there, Sophie almost asleep in his lap, Ellie humming softly as she tidied up the yard, Mark felt something he hadn't recognized in so long that he almost didn't know what it was. Peace. Not the absence of conflict or the successful close of a deal. A deep, genuine peace that came from being exactly where he should be, doing exactly what he should be doing. In that small yard behind a modest Queen's apartment, Mark Davis, the billionaire, the business titan, the empire builder, finally found what his money had never been able to buy. And he knew, with the certainty that only comes when something fundamentally changes within us, that he would never be the same. The photo in the drawer, "My best friend," wasn't just a memory of the past. It was a glimpse of the future he now wanted to rebuild. The day Sarah was finally discharged arrived. Mark woke early, mentally reviewing every detail for the 100th time. The apartment was spotless, clean, organized, repaired. The girls had decorated every corner with drawings, paper flowers, and welcome signs. The pantry and fridge were stocked. The beds had fresh sheets. Everything was ready. "Uncle Mark, what time are we picking Mommy up?" Ellie asked, appearing in the kitchen doorway still in pajamas, hair messy. "In 2 hours," Mark answered, pouring milk over her cereal. "We have time to get ready and pick up flowers on the way." Sophie entered right behind her sister, dragging her stuffed bunny. "Will she like the surprise?" Mark smiled, lifting her onto a chair. "She'll love it. You two did an incredible job." The past 3 weeks had changed Mark in a way he never could have predicted. The man now serving cereal to 2 children, who knew exactly how Sophie liked her milk, warm with a little honey, and which brush worked best for Ellie's tangles, was almost unrecognizable compared to the relentless CEO of Davis Enterprises. While the girls ate, Mark checked his phone. Dozens of unread emails, all notifications silenced except for emergencies. His days now began with cartoons and ended with bedtime stories, not board meetings and business dinners, and surprisingly, he did not miss his old life. Presbyterian Hospital was bathed in sunshine that morning when they arrived to pick up Sarah. The girls ran ahead, excited to see their mother, while Mark followed carrying a large bouquet of daisies and colorful gerberas. When they entered the room, Sarah was already dressed and sitting on the edge of the bed, talking with Dr. Reynolds. Her face was still a little pale, but her eyes shone in a way Mark hadn't seen since they were teenagers. "Mommy!" the girls shouted in unison, rushing to hug her. Sarah wrapped her arms around them, closing her eyes for a moment, as if absorbing every sensation of that hug. Mark stood by the door, watching, feeling both included and like a privileged observer. When Sarah opened her eyes again, she locked eyes with Mark. For a silent moment, something passed between them. Gratitude, understanding, and something else neither was ready to name yet. "Look what we brought," Sophie said, pointing to the flowers Mark held. "They're beautiful," Sarah smiled as Mark stepped forward and handed them to her. "Your favorites," he said quietly. "The girls told me." Sarah seemed surprised, not just by the flowers but by the fact that he'd taken the time to learn this little detail about her. Dr. Reynolds gave some final instructions, medications, rest, follow-up appointments, and then, at last, they were free to leave. Mark grabbed Sarah's small suitcase, while Ellie and Sophie each held one of her hands, excitedly talking about all the surprises they'd prepared. "Don't tell everything now," Mark teased with a smile, "or it won't be a surprise anymore." In the car, the girls could hardly sit still, their excitement overflowing. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, looking a bit worn out just from walking from the hospital to the parking lot. "Are you okay?" Mark asked quietly, while the girls argued in the back over which part of the surprise their mom should see first. "I'm fine," Sarah nodded, her smile gentle, "just still a bit tired, but happy, very happy." She looked at him for a moment, her eyes searching his face. "You look different, Mark." "Different how?" "More present." It was a simple observation, but remarkably accurate. In a few weeks, Mark had gone from constantly being somewhere else in his mind, always planning the next step, always calculating, to being fully in the moment. 5 hours. When they arrived at the small Queen's apartment, Mark felt uncharacteristically nervous. He and the girls had worked hard on the surprise. What if Sarah didn't like the changes? What if they'd touched something personal? "Close your eyes, Mommy," Ellie instructed when they reached the door. Sarah obliged, smiling as her daughters carefully guided her inside. Mark hung back slightly, carrying the suitcase and observing the three of them. "You can open them," Sophie announced, practically bouncing with excitement. Sarah opened her eyes and was momentarily speechless. The apartment, which she had left 3 weeks earlier when she was weak and ill, now looked transformed, immaculately clean. Windows open, letting in light and fresh air, vases of fresh flowers adorning the living room. On the chalkboard wall, a colorful message read, "Welcome home, Mommy," surrounded by hearts and stars. Even more impressive were the small repairs. No more leaky kitchen faucet. The back step was solid. New curtains hung at the windows, and dozens of other details she probably hadn't noticed yet. You did all this?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky with emotion. "Uncle Mark fixed the broken things," Sophie said proudly. "He can use tools, and we helped clean and decorate," Ellie added. "We did it all together," Mark said softly, setting down the suitcase. "The girls are great helpers." Sarah walked slowly through the living room, touching the furniture, taking in each detail. When she reached the kitchen, she found fresh bread on the counter, a fully stocked fridge, and a vase of daisies on the small table. "Mark," she turned to him, eyes brimming with tears she was trying to hold back. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he replied simply. "We're just happy you're home." The ease with which he said "we," including himself in their little family, did not go unnoticed by Sarah. She looked at him for a moment. Mark Davis, the billionaire, standing in her modest kitchen in jeans and a t-shirt, with a smudge of colorful paint on his sleeve, likely Sophie's doing, looking perfectly at ease. "Mommy, come see your room," Ellie called, tugging at her hand. Sarah's bedroom was also tidy. Fresh sheets, freshly laundered curtains, and a small pot of violets on the nightstand. "That was Uncle Mark's idea," Sophie said. "He said you'd need lots of rest." Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, clearly overwhelmed. 3 weeks in the hospital had been difficult, not just physically but mentally, worrying about her daughters, to discover not only that they were fine, but that her home had been cared for so lovingly, was almost too much to process. "I think Mommy needs a bit of rest now," Mark said gently, noticing how tired Sarah looked. "How about you two go play in the yard while I make some tea?" The girls agreed, though reluctant to leave their mother so soon. Mark guided them outside, promising to join them soon. In the kitchen, as the water boiled, Mark reflected on how his life had changed in just a month. In March, he was a lonely man obsessed with work, living in a cold yet luxurious apartment. Now in April, here he was making tea in his childhood friend's modest kitchen, having spent the past weeks caring for her kids, fixing her home, and somehow fixing himself in the process. When he returned to the bedroom with a mug of chamomile tea, he found Sarah gazing out the window, watching her daughters play in the yard. "They're okay," she said softly, without turning. "Better than I expected." Mark set the tea on the nightstand and approached, standing beside her. "They're amazing kids, Sarah, strong, smart, loving." "How did they behave? At your apartment, I mean?" Mark smiled. "On the first day, I thought I'd made a huge mistake. I had no idea what to do with two little kids. My apartment had nothing for them, no toys, no children's books, not even the right food." He paused, remembering. "But they taught me." "Taught you?" Sarah turned, curious. "How to build sheet forts, how to draw unicorns, how not to be afraid of making a mess." He chuckled softly. "My decorator would probably have a heart attack if she saw my place now. There are drawings on the fridge, toys everywhere, and an impressive collection of children's books." Sarah smiled, imagining the scene. "I feel like I should apologize for the inconvenience, but—" "No," Mark interrupted kindly but firmly. "It was the opposite of inconvenient, Sarah. It was a gift." She studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his as she used to when they were young, always able to see past his defenses. "You've changed, Mark." "I've come back," he corrected gently, "to who I was before I got lost." Sarah nodded in understanding. She took a sip of the tea, her eyes drifting back to the yard where the girls were playing. "Shall we go outside? The fresh air will do me good." The small backyard looked glorious that spring afternoon. The single flower bed, which Mark and the girls had carefully weeded and watered over the past days, showcased daisies, small sunflowers, and a few colorful tulips. The old tree in the corner offered a pleasant shade over the grassy area where Ellie and Sophie now played with some toys. Mark helped Sarah down the porch steps and guided her to the garden chairs he'd fixed. From where they sat, they could watch the girls while they talked. For a moment, neither spoke. There was so much to say, so many years to fill in, it was hard to know where to start. "I found the photo," Mark finally said, still watching the girls instead of her. "Ours, from when we were teenagers." The back said, "My best friend," Sarah finished, smiling softly. "I wondered if you'd see it." "Why did you keep it?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. Sarah was silent for a moment, thinking, "It wasn't a conscious decision, you know. I didn't think, I'll keep this in case he ever comes back. It was just an important part of my life. A good part." She paused. "You mattered to me, Mark. Even after we went our separate ways." Mark felt a lump in his throat. "I'm sorry for not staying in touch, for not coming back like I promised. You were building your life. That's no excuse." "No," she agreed. "It isn't, but it's understandable. You always wanted more, always knew there was something bigger waiting for you out there." Sarah looked at the girls for a moment. "I had my own dreams too. Some came true, some didn't. But I've made peace with the path I chose." Mark studied her profile, the same slightly upturned nose, the same determined chin. Sarah had always had a quiet beauty, the kind that didn't demand attention but stayed with you. "I want to help," he said at last. "With the girls. With everything." Sarah turned to face him, her eyes suddenly wary. "Mark, not as charity," he quickly clarified, "and I'm not trying to buy your forgiveness or ease my guilt." "Then why?" "Because I care about you all. About all three of you." He took a deep breath, sorting through his thoughts. "I want to ensure their future, school, security, but also love." The last word came out almost like a whisper, as if he himself was surprised to say it. But it was true. In these weeks with Ellie and Sophie, Mark had rediscovered his capacity to love, to care deeply, to put others' needs before his own. Sarah watched him for a long moment, tears welling up. "Thank you for coming back as you," she finally said, voice thick with emotion. Not as someone who wants to fix everything, but as someone who wants to stay. The distinction was crucial, showing how well she still knew him, maybe better than he knew himself. The old Mark would have shown up with lawyers and documents, setting up trust funds and perfect educational plans, maintaining a safe emotional distance. This new Mark, or maybe the original Mark rediscovered, wanted to be involved, to be present, to be part of their lives. "Uncle Mark, come see what we found," Ellie called from the other side of the yard, where she and Sophie were crouched over something on the ground. "Go," Sarah smiled. "Duty calls." Mark stood but hesitated. "Are you sure you'll be okay alone for a minute?" "I'm home, surrounded by the people I love. I'm better than okay." He nodded and walked over to the girls, who had discovered a small family of ladybugs under a leaf. Kneeling on the grass to admire them, Mark realized how surreal the image must look. Him, the executive, squatting in a suburban backyard, marveling at tiny insects with two small children, while their mother watched from the porch. It was such a simple, ordinary scene, yet it meant everything. When he returned to Sarah, she had closed her eyes, soaking up the afternoon sun. He sat quietly, not wanting to disturb her peace. Without opening her eyes, Sarah reached out, searching for his hand. Mark took it without hesitation, their fingers interlacing naturally, as if 20 years of separation were just a brief interlude. "You came back," she said softly, finally opening her eyes to look at him. "And now?" "I'm staying," he replied, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the small yard where Ellie and Sophie danced among the flowers, chasing the last butterflies of the day. A soft breeze carried the scent of blossoms and the sound of the girls' laughter. Sarah rested her head on Mark's shoulder, a gesture so natural it felt like they'd been doing it every day for the past 20 years. Sitting there, her hand in his, watching those two little lives that had unknowingly transformed his own, Mark Davis finally understood what he'd been looking for all those years of achievements. It wasn't success, or wealth, or recognition. It was belonging. It was this feeling of being exactly where he needed to be, with exactly whom he needed to be. Sometimes all we need to find ourselves again is a simple backyard, two small hands, and someone who kept our memory alive. And as day turned gently into night, two souls that once walked together, then parted ways, found their path back to one another. Not as they were before, but as they had become. Wiser, more mature, more aware of the precious value of the connection they shared. On the horizon, the first stars twinkled, silent witnesses to a friendship that, after 20 years asleep, finally began to grow again. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like, because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.